It's not groundbreaking to say the Switch might hold the biggest game collection of all Nintendo consoles we have seen so far. No other hardware offers so many different franchises, new and old, and even though there are some IPs left for another return, it's hard to complain after such a selection of unique games. We have Pokemon, Mario or Zelda, but just as usual, it seems like Kirby's kinda left out of the discussion of how present a franchise can be on the Switch. There's the running joke of receiving a new Kirby every year, but often I get the impression people are not quite aware how strong the series is dominating the Switch. After all, there are only 2 mainline titles and 1 remake so far, nothing other IPs haven't seen before. To give Kirby's outstanding performance on the Switch one last honor before the next system releases, watch Nintendo release one final Kirby game after this video. Let's retrospect the development of Kirby on the Switch, why the handheld is the best console to start the series with, remember some probably already forgotten titles, and finally understand why the Switch is the ultimate Kirby machine. This is Nintendo Switch Online, the company's subscription service to offer a plethora of classic Nintendo experiences, previously accessible with a virtual console on prior hardware. A library of Nintendo's history, and while there are some titles missing, it still portrays the bulk of games you have played in the past. Initially, there wasn't much Kirby to talk about, but since the inclusion of Game Boy, Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo 64, the numbers skyrocketed and there are only very few titles left. Kirby's Dream Land, Dream Land 2, Dream Land 3, 64, Adventure, Superstar and even niche titles like Star Stacker, previously only released in Japan, found their way onto the Switch, not to speak of entries benefiting from the features of Nintendo Switch Online. Before their inclusion, Amazing Mirror and Tilt and Tumble could not be played the way they were envisioned, since no one wanted to bring their Game Boys together and connect them with a link cable, in Amazing Mirror's case, or Tilt, the GameCube for Tilt and Tumble. Here you can play both games perfectly fine, without having to forego any features that gave those titles their identity. The same could be said about Dreamland or Dreamland 2. Not as severe as in the prior cases, but with the color filter, you can enjoy both classics with a proper visualization. To circumvent the frustrating trial and error puzzles from Dreamland 3 or 64, save states make life much easier, and you don't have to restart the level again in case you lose a necessary copy ability. In fact, in particular cases you can even select special game fights with an already completed playthrough and experience secret final bosses without collecting everything. Important to mention, the cheat code for Kirby 64 still works. As a matter of fact, there has never been a better time in trying old classics with contemporary quality of life features, without taking away the good part or actual challenge. The most impressive aspect I haven't mentioned, there are still some titles left we can look forward to. For some reason, Nightmare in Dreamland has yet to be released, with other less important spin-offs potentially waiting as well. The only question remaining is how to start. Basically every mainline title offers itself greatly since none of them aged poorly. Kirby's Adventure still has the annoying frame rate issues, but past Kirby games were as accessible as today's representatives. Which is why you can simply start with Dreamland, one of the successors, Superstar or any other title. The best part about having all those entries is how you can clearly live through each essential era of Kirby to some extent, including retail releases. Kirby's first steps with Dreamland incredibly short and a breeze to play through, Superstar, which established a bunch of franchise-defining features, the GBA period with the Amazing Mirror, spin-offs like Tilt and Tumble or Avalanche, not to speak of the very first steps of 3D with the crystal shards if you want a somewhat more difficult title. All of this, however, only applies to Nintendo Switch Online, so what if you do not want to pay for the subscription, let alone the additional one? Even without those classics, the Switch still holds some amazingly solid entries in its catalog, some of them only released on the eShop. There may be people arguing the 3DS shows stronger mainline titles with Triple Deluxe or Planet Robobot, and the Switch started rather shaky with the heavily argued Star Allies, but it depends on your point of view. Yes, both 3DS entries are fantastic continuations of Return to Dreamland's foundation, and should definitely one day be ported to a proper home console with modern visuals, but in my mind they're extremely well done fun, yet safe mainline games. As hard as it might sound, if you have played one of the modern 2D titles, you're going to have a pretty appropriate idea on what you can expect from them, which is not saying they are lackluster, but simply predictable. I'm a fan, but I'm fair enough it kinda led to Star Allies mixed reception. If this would be the only mainline title on the Switch so far, then yes, the discussion would look different. A weaker main game combined with countless classics versus two incredibly strong titles, with only a couple past adventures for the Virtual Console. Luckily, at the second half of the hybrid's life cycle, we received what should become the most successful release of the entire franchise, and maybe even best game in the series. To explain why the Forgotten Land raised the IP to great heights is self-explanatory at this point, but to put it in short terms, it offers one of the most innovative experiments since many years and is praised by nearly everyone who played it. This game alone probably cements the Switch as one of the best Kirby consoles of all time, and there could not have been a better way to end the mainline series. But it's Kirby, so the franchise cannot wait 1 month until the next release. A year after the Forgotten Land, Nintendo gifts us with a remake of Return to Dreamland, a game similar, as impactful as the Forgotten Land. Considering how fast it was released after the Forgotten Land and Dream Buffet, no one expected real ambition besides upgraded visuals, additional minigames and smaller quality of life improvements. Those features alone would have made the deluxe version fine enough, and no one would have most likely complained. But it's Kirby, so it has to be more than that. Despite the fact we just received 2 games, nothing about Return to Dreamland Deluxe screams cheap. Quite the opposite actually. They didn't simply reuse Star Allies' art style, implemented a ton of fan favorite minigames, fine-tuned the base game with a lot of improvements, and just casually added maybe the greatest bonus adventure of all Kirby titles. If this is the final Kirby game on the Switch, it's a more than worthy ending. And like I mentioned, you can go through every era of Kirby with Nintendo's hybrid console, including the Wii with the remake, and even a glimpse of what we assume is going to be the roadmap of the future. Obviously, this is not all. Taking a look into the eShop, there are some smaller entries, one of them being free to play, while the others are sold for a budget price, a concept Nintendo normally is not aware of. Super Kirby Clash can be played without paying anything, and you can purchase helpful items to speed up your progress in the game. For many people, it's quite a questionable practice, considering how children are the target group, especially with Kirby's case, but it's not as bad as you think. The game can be played perfectly fine and you feel never forced to buy anything. If this is not your cup of tea, there's also Fighters 2, a short, sweet brawler, including a surprisingly entertaining story mode, arenas and many copy abilities / fighters. Together with Dream Buffet, the only completely original spin-off, you get a pleasant compilation of smaller budget titles, very similar to the ones of the 3DS, yet a little more elaborated. My personal recommendation would be Dream Buffet, as it's the most accessible one, unexpectedly addicting and feels like a little celebration of the franchise. Although I regard the Switch as the overall greater package, I should not disregard the 3DS's accomplishments. I would not blame you for thinking the eShop exclusive entries are far superior, since some of them celebrate their debut on this handheld. In fact, even Forgotten Land's roots can be traced all the way back to Blowout Blast, an unexpectedly competent adventure for what it is. Additionally, Triple Deluxe as well as Planet Robobot are accompanied by 2 other titles. Admittedly quite divisive, but appreciated with some certain conditions. Battle Royale, while lackluster in content, is a fully fledged spin-off retail release, something the Switch never received. Extra Epic Yarn on the other hand offers one of the most charming adventures of the Wii. Generally downgraded, but ignoring the lost potential, the main quality campaign is nonetheless there. Conclusively, the 3DS and Switch kinda go toe to toe when it comes to Kirby, and depending on your preference, you may favor one or the other, but the sheer fact how much past there is to experience on the Switch on top of the Forgotten Land or Return to Dreamland Deluxe will always put the hybrid handheld on a higher pedestal for me. Although I presented a couple examples, I still haven't really dived into every single one, and counting all of those games together, you can experience over 15 Kirby titles on the Switch. Nearly half the franchise, mind you, and we are still not at the end of the road. While it's highly unlikely to receive another mainline entry, there's still the option for another smaller eShop release, or the missing Nightmare in Dreamland for Nintendo Switch Online. No matter how you look at it, there was simply never a better moment to try out one of the endless quality games. And generally, never a better time to be a fan as well as newcomer. The best part about all of this though, seeing how the Switch successor is going to improve on that solid foundation and ride the wave of success the series is currently enjoying. Let's assume the next home console will be fairly similar to the Switch and carry on the online subscription service. After all, it only makes sense considering how it would appear pretty stupid to add Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games so late into the life cycle if they would plainly start from scratch again. Everything that is not a Switch 2 seems ridiculous, so transporting all those classics over already provides the next system with roughly 10 games. Now let's take a step further and include the possibility of backwards compatibility, meaning being able to play normal Switch games on the follow-up. We would get all of those titles on top of upcoming quality new adventures, even more spin-offs and whatever else they have planned for the future. While I mentioned the high quality of most classics and modern entries, I was mainly talking about the quantity, however. There could be a million aged Kirby titles, and no matter how strong that legacy might be, there is the possibility of some players being mainly interested in contemporary games. It's not like Kirby lacks any modern great options, but with the Forgotten Land setting a new standard of what Kirby can be in terms of scope, attention to detail and overall staging, we can only imagine how strong the future of the series will be carried on. Naturally, the same could have been said about Planet Robobot being followed up by one of the disappointments in the franchise, even though it seemed like Planet Robobot perfected two-dimensional Kirby titles. But Forgotten Land is the most successful entry in the series, unlike Planet Robobot, which was only amazingly received by fans but mildly triumphant financially. So it certainly helped Nintendo to consider increasing the recognition Kirby needs to become even greater with higher budgets and more manpower. We can already witness the fruits of the Forgotten Land's fortune, with job descriptions looking for a bunch of necessary positions to create the next chapter of Kirby. The future of the Pink Glutton was never more promising, and while the Switch advantageously disclosed the legacy of Kirby by revealing the past, the next system is going to mainly focus on forming an exciting prospect we will not see coming.